Off the Pacific coast of Costa Rica, 340 miles from any other land, sits a small green island that holds more buried treasure than anywhere else on Earth. No roads, no towns, no survivors of the men who hid the gold. For over 300 years, Cocos Island has swallowed fortunes, broken explorers, and refused to give up a single one of its secrets. 500 expeditions have searched it. Almost nothing has been found. This is the real story of Cocos Island. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand Cocos, you have to understand the river of silver that ran through the Pacific in the 1600s and 1700s. It is the early 17th century. Spain controls almost everything on the western side of South America. After Pizarro crushed the Inca Empire, in the 1530s, the Spanish crown took possession of mountains that nobody in Europe had imagined could exist. In the highlands of what is now Bolivia, the Spanish found Potosi, a mountain made of silver. They forced indigenous laborers and enslaved Africans into the mines, and they pulled silver out of the earth in quantities that broke the European economy. So much silver flowed out of Potosi that historians estimated accounted for the majority of all silver produced on Earth during its peak years. The silver had to get back to Spain. The route was complicated. From Potosi, it traveled by mule train down to the Pacific coast to the port of Callao near Lima. From Callao, it was loaded onto ships and sailed north to Panama. There it was, carried by mule across the isthmus to the Caribbean side. And from there, the great treasure fleets, the famous galleons, carried it across the Atlantic to Seville. Every step of this journey was a target. Every step was vulnerable. And the most overlooked, least defended step of all was the Pacific leg, the run from Callao to Panama. The Spanish believed the Pacific was their private lake. They called it the Spanish Lake. For most of the 1500s and into the 1600s, that belief was correct. No European rival had managed to bring significant numbers of ships around the southern tip of South America through the brutal seas of Cape Horn into the Pacific. The treasure fleet sailed those waters with confidence. They did not expect attacks. They were almost never attacked until they were. By the late 1600s, English and Dutch raiders had figured out how to make the passage. They came through the Strait of Magellan, or they rounded the Horn, and they appeared in waters where the Spanish had grown careless. The Spanish silver was suddenly accessible to men willing to make a journey that killed half of everyone who attempted it. And the men willing to make that journey were exactly the men you would expect, hungry, dangerous, and entirely committed to the idea that the wealth of empires was theirs to take. These were not the pirates of the Caribbean. These were rarer, harder men. The Pacific was not a sea you raided casually. There was no Tortuga to retreat to, no friendly French or English port to refit and resupply in. A pirate who came into the Pacific committed to it. He was thousands of miles from any safe harbor. If his ship was damaged, he had to repair it himself on a beach somewhere with whatever tools he had brought. If his men got sick, they died. If he captured a Spanish galleon loaded with silver, he could not simply sail home. He had to figure out where to put it. The first major English raider in the Pacific was Francis Drake, who in 1579 captured a Spanish treasure ship called the Cacafuego and made himself the richest commoner in England. Drake's voyage was a state-sponsored expedition with the quiet blessing of Queen Elizabeth. But the principle he demonstrated was simple. The Pacific could be raided, the silver could be taken, and the men who took it could survive long enough to enjoy it if they were clever about where they hid it on the way home. After Drake, a steady trickle of raiders followed. William Dampier, the English buccaneer, who would later become the first man to circumnavigate the globe 3 times, operated in the Pacific in the 1680s and 1690s. He kept detailed journals. He was in his way a scientist as much as a pirate, and he and his companions began to recognize something about the geography of the Pacific that the Spanish had missed. There were islands out there, small ones, unmapped ones, islands that could be used. One of those islands was Cocos. Cocos Island sits alone in the Pacific. The nearest mainland is Costa Rica, 340 miles to the east. The nearest other island is the Galapagos, more than 400 miles to the south. It is roughly 5 miles long and 2 miles wide. Its peaks rise nearly 2,000 feet out of the sea. It is one of the wettest places on Earth. Rain falls there nearly every day. Mist clings to the jungle. Streams cut down the volcanic rock and pour off the cliffs as waterfalls that drop directly into the ocean. The Spanish knew Cocos existed. A Spanish navigator named Joan Cabezas had documented it in the early 1500s, but the Spanish had no use for it. There was no gold on Cocos. There was no native population to enslave. There was no harbor large enough for a treasure fleet. The island was, from the Spanish perspective, worthless. This was a serious miscalculation. For a pirate sailing the Pacific with a hold full of stolen silver, Cocos was perfect. It had two sheltered bays on its northern coast, Chatham Bay and Wafer Bay, both deep enough to anchor a ship in. It had freshwater streams that allowed crews to refill their barrels. It had wild pigs and seabirds for food. It had dense jungle that could hide a man, a chest, or a small army. And most importantly, it was nowhere. No Spanish patrol would think to look there. No rival pirate would stumble across it by accident. A man could leave something on Cocos, sail away to spend a few years doing other things, and come back to find it exactly where he left it. By the late 1600s, Cocos had become known among the small fraternity of Pacific raiders as a place where things could be hidden, not a base, not a colony, a vault. The men who used it operated by rules that were never written down. The historical record is fragmentary, pieced together from journals, court testimony, and the tales pirates told in their final days before execution. But a rough picture emerges. A pirate captain returning from a successful raid might stop at Cocos to deposit a portion of his haul, intending to return for it later. He might bury it himself, or he might trust a small group of officers to do it with him. The location was usually marked, sometimes with carved stones, sometimes with reference to natural features. Maps were drawn, maps were lost, maps were copied incorrectly by men who could barely write. The strange thing about this system, and the thing that fascinates historians, is that it required a kind of trust that pirates rarely extended to each other. To hide treasure on Cocos and leave it there meant trusting that your crewmates would not return without you. It meant trusting that no rival captain would torture the location out of someone in a tavern in Panama. It meant trusting an island. And here's where things start to get genuinely interesting, because the island, by all accounts, kept its promises. Treasure hidden on Cocos in the 1680s could still be there in the 1820s. Treasure hidden on Cocos in the 1820s could still be there today. The problem was not that Cocos failed to keep the treasure safe. The problem was that the men who hid it kept dying before they could come back. They died in storms. They died in battles. They died on the gallows in Panama or Lima or Boston, with the location of their fortune held secret on their tongues. They died of malaria, of fever, of knife wounds in alleys. And the treasure stayed where they had put it, held by the island, waiting for someone who, in most cases, never came. The first of the great hiders was a man named Benito. Benito was Portuguese, though most accounts call him Spanish or Brazilian. And the truth of his origins is now impossible to pin down. He had served as an officer in the Spanish or Portuguese Navy. Some accounts say he had been a respected captain. Others say he was a deserter from the beginning. What is certain is that by the early 1800s, he was operating as a pirate in the Pacific under a name that meant, in Spanish, Benito, the Bloody Sword. He preferred a different name for himself. He called himself the Sword of God. Bonito was active during the chaos of the early 19th century, when the Spanish Empire in the Americas was collapsing into revolution. The wars of independence had thrown the Pacific coast into disorder. Spanish authority was failing. Treasure shipments were being moved hastily and often without adequate escort. Bonito understood the moment. He attacked Spanish ships off the coast of Mexico and Peru. He attacked coastal towns. He accumulated, according to multiple sources, an enormous fortune in gold and silver coin, religious artifacts, and church plates stolen from cathedrals along the coast. In 1819 or 1820, depending on which account you trust, Benito sailed to Cocos Island. He landed at Wafer Bay. He spent several days ashore with a small group of his most trusted men. They returned to the ship and sailed away. The treasure, by every account that has survived, was buried somewhere on the island. The quantity is variously estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars in modern value. Benito never came back. A British warship caught his vessel off the coast of Central America. Some accounts say he was killed in the engagement. Others say he shot himself rather than be taken alive. His crew was captured. Several were hanged. Those who survived were imprisoned, and at least 2 of them lived long enough to talk about Cocos. Their descriptions were vague enough to be useless and specific enough to torment treasure hunters for the next 2 centuries. The second hider is the one whose story is best documented and most painful. His name was William Thompson. Thompson was the British captain of a merchant ship called the Mary Dear. In 1820, he was in the port of Callao, near Lima, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. The wars of independence had reached Lima. The army of José de San Martín was approaching the city. The Spanish authorities and the wealthy Spanish loyalists understood that the city was about to fall, and they began desperately trying to evacuate their wealth. The most precious objects in Lima, the treasures of its cathedrals, and the personal fortunes of its richest citizens needed to be moved somewhere safe until the political situation resolved. The Spanish authorities approached William Thompson. They asked him to take the treasure aboard the Mary Dear, sail it out into the Pacific, keep it safe for a few months, and return it when Lima was secure. They paid him handsomely. They put Spanish guards aboard his ship to ensure his cooperation. The cargo they loaded was extraordinary gold and silver bullion. Solid gold candlesticks, jeweled chalices, religious statues, including one famously described as a life-sized Virgin Mary cast in solid gold and studded with emeralds. The total value by the standards of the time was almost incalculable. By modern estimates, the Lima treasure, as it came to be called, would be worth somewhere between several hundred million and over $1 billion. Thompson sailed out of Callao in 1820 with the treasure aboard. Once at sea, he and his crew murdered the Spanish guards, threw their bodies overboard, and changed course. They sailed to Cocos Island. They landed at one of the bays, almost certainly Wafer Bay, though some accounts say Chatham. They spent several days hiding the treasure in a location that Thompson alone would know in its entirety. Then they sailed away, intending to disperse, lie low, and return individually or in small groups when the political situation in Lima had stabilized enough that the treasure could be moved to a permanent location and quietly converted into livable wealth. The plan failed within weeks. A Spanish warship captured the Mary Dear Thompson, and his crew were arrested for piracy. Most of his men were hanged in Panama. Thompson and one other officer, the first mate, were spared on the condition that they lead the Spanish back to the treasure. They agreed. The Spanish ship sailed with them to Cocos. Thompson and the first mate were put ashore. They walked into the jungle, ostensibly to retrieve the treasure. They did not come back. They had escaped into the interior of the island. The Spanish searched for them. The Spanish searched for the treasure. They found neither. After several weeks, they gave up and sailed away. Thompson and the first mate, by some accounts, were eventually rescued years later by a passing whaler. Thompson is said to have made his way back to Newfoundland, where he lived in poverty for the rest of his life, telling the story of the treasure to anyone who would listen, but never himself going back to retrieve it. On his deathbed, by one widely repeated account, he passed a rough map to a friend named John Keating. Keating, in turn, supposedly made his way to Cocos in the 1840s, found at least a small portion of the treasure, but was unable to retrieve the bulk of it before circumstances forced him to flee. After Keating, the trail fragments completely. Dozens of men claimed to have copies of Thompson's map. Most of those maps were forgeries sold to desperate buyers. The location of the Lima treasure died with Thompson, or with Keating, or with someone in between. It has never been credibly located since. The third figure is the one the island broke most thoroughly. His name was August Gissler. He was German, born in 1857 in the town of Remscheid. As a young man, he went to sea. He worked on ships in the Pacific. And sometime in the 1880s, he became fixated on Cocos Island, and the treasure's rumored to lie buried there. Gissler was not a fool. He was a careful, methodical man. He read every account he could find. He interviewed sailors who claimed to have inherited maps or stories from earlier generations. He pieced together what he believed was a credible understanding of where the major caches had been hidden. And in 1889, he did something no one else had been willing to do. He moved to Cocos. He convinced the government of Costa Rica, which had claimed the island in 1832, to grant him a concession as the island's governor and settler. He brought a small group of German colonists with him. They built a small settlement at Wafer Bay. The colony failed within a few years. Most of the settlers left. Gissler stayed. He stayed for nearly 20 years. For 2 decades, August Gissler lived almost entirely alone on Cocos Island. He hunted wild pigs for food. He grew vegetables in a small clearing. He drank from the streams, and every day, when the rain was not too heavy to work in, he dug. He dug at every location that any map or story had ever suggested. He dug at the heads of streams where the old pirate accounts said treasure was often hidden. He dug at the bases of distinctive rock formations. He dug at the edges of the bays. He cut paths through jungle that grew back faster than he could clear it. He surveyed and resurveyed. He carried the heavy clay soil in buckets up and down hillsides. He found over the course of those 20 years a total of 6 gold coins. 6. In 1908, Gissler finally gave up. He was over 50 years old. His health was failing. He had spent his entire adult life and every penny he had ever earned on the island, and he had nothing to show for it. He returned to Germany. He died there in 1935, having spent his last years working as a clerk and telling visitors that the treasure was real, that it was still there. that he had simply been digging in the wrong places. He had not been digging in the wrong places. He had been digging on an island that, for whatever reason, does not give up what has been buried in it. That is the pattern. That is the thing that should make any reasonable person stop and look at this story differently. Step back from the individual hunters and look at what Cocos has actually done over 3 centuries. More than 500 expeditions have searched it. Some have been small private ventures, some have been backed by enormous resources. In the 1920s, a wealthy American named Malcolm Campbell, who would later become famous for setting land speed records, mounted a major expedition to Cocos. He found nothing. In the 1960s, French divers and treasure hunters mounted multiple expeditions. They found nothing of significance. In the 1990s and 2000s, expeditions equipped with ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, satellite imagery, and modern excavation equipment combed sections of the island. They found nothing they could verify as part of any historical cache. The island, across 3 centuries of searching, has produced a handful of coins, some scraps that might be debris from old pirate camps, and an enormous quantity of disappointment. This is not a story about gold. This is a story about what gold does to people. The pattern repeats with such consistency across the centuries that it stops looking like coincidence. A man arrives at Cocos certain that he understands something the previous searchers did not. He has a better map, a better theory, a better technology. He commits, he invests, he digs, he searches, he spends a year or 5 or 20. He finds almost nothing. He leaves broken, financially ruined, often physically ruined, sometimes psychologically destroyed. And within a few years, the next man arrives, equally certain, equally committed, equally doomed. The island became, over the course of 3 centuries, a kind of machine for absorbing human longing. It took dreams in and produced nothing in return except more dreams. The men who survived Cocos came home with stories. The stories convinced other men to go. Those men also failed. They also came home with stories. And the stories kept being told. There's a question buried in this that is worth asking, honestly. Is the treasure even there? The historical evidence for Bonito's cache is thin. The historical evidence for the Lima treasure is somewhat better. But the chain of custody from Thompson's deathbed to any modern map is broken in too many places to trust. It is entirely possible, and a growing number of historians believe it is likely, that most of what is rumored to be on Cocos was never there. The treasures may have been seized by other parties before reaching the island. They may have been deposited and later retrieved by men whose retrieval was never recorded. They may have been smaller than legend claims, or different in composition, or scattered rather than concentrated. It does not matter. The legend long ago outgrew the question of whether any specific cache exists. Cocos became, in the imagination of treasure hunters, the place where treasure must be, and that belief became its own engine. The dream of gold on Cocos has been more powerful, more durable, and arguably more valuable than any actual gold that may or may not be there. That is the deeper truth of the island. It is not a story about pirates. It is a story about a small green rock in the Pacific that for 300 years has held the dreams of a particular kind of man, and held them with such force that no amount of evidence has ever shaken them loose. Today, Cocos Island is a Costa Rican national park. It was declared a protected area in 1978. It became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1997. Treasure hunting has been illegal there since the early 20th century, though that has not stopped a handful of people from trying. The island is now best known to the world, not for its treasure, but for its waters. The seas around Cocos are among the richest marine environments on Earth. Hammerhead sharks gather there in schools of hundreds. Whale sharks pass through. The diving is considered some of the best in the world. The treasure that the island produces now is biological, ecological, and visible only to those who come not to dig but to look. The dig sites are gone. The jungle has reclaimed them. The paths that August Gisler cut have grown over. The remnants of his small settlement at Wafer Bay are barely visible. The trenches that previous expeditions dug have collapsed and filled with rainwater and roots. If you walk the island today, you would have to be told where the digging happened. You would not see it. The stories remain. Robert Louis Stevenson, when he wrote Treasure Island in 1883, drew on the wider tradition of pirate treasure stories that included Cocos. Some scholars argue that specific elements of his fictional island are drawn from Cocos itself, though the case is impossible to prove and Stevenson never confirmed it. Michael Crichton, when he wrote Jurassic Park in 1990, set his fictional Isla Nublar in the same Pacific waters and based its geography on islands of that region. Cocos has appeared directly or in disguise in dozens of novels, films, television shows, and video games. It has become a kind of platonic ideal of the treasure island in the Western imagination. The strange thing is that this fictional afterlife may be the most valuable thing Cocos ever produced. The Bonito cache, if it existed, is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The Lima treasure, if it existed, is worth more than $1 billion. Both of those sums, if anyone ever managed to extract them, would be enormous, but the cultural value of Cocos, the value of every story it has inspired and every imagination it has captured, exceeds both numbers many times over. The island never owed anyone its gold. It made no promise. The promises were all made by the men who hid things there and the men who came looking. The island just kept doing what it had always done. It held what was given to it. It denied what was demanded of it. It absorbed the longing of men who could not let it go. And it sits there now, mostly quiet, mostly forgotten in the practical sense, surrounded by the richest waters of the Pacific. The fog still rolls in every afternoon. The waterfalls still pour off the cliffs into the sea. Somewhere in the jungle, possibly sit chests of gold that men killed each other to hide, or possibly not. The island will not say. There's one more thing worth noting before we close this story. August Gissler, the German who spent 20 years digging and found 6 coins, never stopped believing the treasure was there. In his final years in Germany, working as a clerk, telling his stories to anyone who would listen, he was asked many times whether he regretted his decades on the island. He always said no. He said the island had given him something more valuable than gold. He said it had given him a life that meant something because he had spent it chasing something real. He may have been right. He may have been the only treasure hunter in 3 centuries to actually understand what Cocos was offering. Cocos was never just an island. It was a mirror, a green stone in the Pacific that showed every man who came to it exactly what he was willing to lose for a dream. Some of them lost their fortunes. Some of them lost their lives. Some of them, like Gissler, lost 20 years and called it a fair trade. The gold, if it is there, has stayed where it was put. But the longing it created has crossed oceans, filled libraries, built cathedrals of imagination in places the original pirates could never have pictured. The men who buried treasure on Cocos thought they were hiding wealth. They were actually planting something else. They were planting a story. And the story, unlike the gold, has never stayed buried.